The helicopter pilot told me the weather window was 30 minutes, and I had 14 crew members to move off a compromised offshore platform, and somewhere on that platform was the one man who had been right about everything for 6 months and who I had been professionally obligated to receive, sign for, and say absolutely nothing to about any of it. I want to be clear about the situation before I tell you what happened. I need you to understand the context before any of the rest of this makes sense. I'm Calix Orde, 34 years old, Emergency Response Coordinator for Petrovan Gulf Operations, which is a title that means I'm the person they call when something on one of their 8 Gulf of Mexico platforms goes wrong. Chemical engineering degree, 8 years in offshore emergency management, more platforms in worse conditions than I can accurately count. I know what I'm doing. This is the important baseline. The Stellan 7 is a natural gas production platform 62 miles offshore of Galveston. It runs 3 compression trains that process and pressurize gas for pipeline export, and it had been the subject of 6 months of U.S. Coast Guard Marine Safety write-ups for, among other things, PSV testing intervals on compression train 3, secondary containment integrity on the separator deck, and emergency shutdown system calibration on the same train. The man writing up those items was Emrys Hale, Marine Safety Inspector, USCG Marine Safety Detachment, Galveston, 31 years old, which I knew because his rank plate told me approximately how long he'd been doing this. Quiet in a way that was not reassuring, but was very accurate. He had been on the Stellan 7 4 times in 6 months, more than any other platform in our fleet, and every time I had driven to the MSD office personally to receive his findings, because it felt like the right thing to do, and every time he handed me the write-ups with no particular expression, and I received them with no particular expression and said, "We're working on it," I was working on it. That is the thing you need to understand before anything else. I arrived at the Stellan 7 at 14:22, and the first thing I saw from the helicopter was that the platform was already organized for evacuation, which meant the OIM had read the storm correctly. And the second thing I saw was Emrys Hale at the muster station with a clipboard and a Coast Guard inspection bag, directing crew to staging areas with the economy of motion of someone who has been on this platform enough times to know it better than most of the crew. He looked up as the helicopter settled. Our eyes met through the plexiglass. I had seen his face 4 times across a desk and had spent those 4 meetings being extremely professional, and had spent the months in between being, internally, significantly less so in ways I was not going to examine right now because I had 14 people to evacuate in a closing weather window. I climbed out and the Gulf wind hit me like an opinion. Or, he said, not a greeting, an acknowledgement of presence. Hale, I scanned the muster station. Count right. Everyone in immersion suits, no visible panic. Good work. He didn't respond to that. The muster station was his work, and it was correct, and he wasn't going to perform modesty about it. Compression train 3, I said. PSV is showing anomalous pressure oscillation. He held my gaze. I flagged it 2 months ago. I know. 4 months ago, actually. The first write-up. I know. You know. A pause. Precise and intentional. You've been knowing for 4 months. Hale, I'm documenting, he said. Not criticizing. I want the timeline to be accurate. And this is what you need to understand about Emrys Hale before the rest of this makes any sense. He did not editorialize. He did not escalate. He stated the record with the specificity of someone who understood that the record was what mattered. And he had been doing this for 6 months. And every single write-up had been correct. And I had agreed with every one of them. And I could not tell him that I agreed with every one of them because I was the company's emergency response coordinator and he was the Coast Guard inspector. And that is not a relationship that is room for the ERC to tell the inspector, I know you're completely right. I've been trying. We'll talk about the timeline when we're not standing on a platform with a weather window closing, I said. He nodded once. We went to work. The evacuation took 26 minutes. Moving 14 people off an offshore platform in deteriorating weather is not chaos if you've planned for it. And on the Stellan 7, it wasn't, because Emrys had the crew staged correctly, because the OIM Darius had run his drills, and because the basket transfer went with the precision that comes from having thought through exactly this scenario. I managed communications, manifest, transfer sequence. Emrys managed the muster point and pre-boarding checklist, which is not normally an inspector's job, and which he had clearly decided was necessary. And nobody argued with him because he knew the procedures as well as anyone on the deck. At 14 crew members were in the helicopter. The pilot told me she could make one more run if we needed it, but the window was closing fast. We're staying, I said. Emrys looked at me. Train 3 needs monitoring through the anomaly. I'm not leaving that to automated systems in a Category 2. I looked at him. You don't have to. My inspection isn't complete, he said. Your inspection should be the last thing you... My inspection includes current operational status of the systems I've cited. Flat, not hostile. I'm staying. We both looked at the pilot. She gave us the expression of someone who has dealt with offshore personnel long enough to stop being surprised. Dawn. if the forecast holds. She leaned out. You two have a good night. The helicopter lifted, and then it was just the platform, and the building storm, and Emrys Hale, and the particular silence of a person who hasn't yet said what they're going to say. But before I get to what happened in that control room, I need to tell you something. Because this is the detail that changes the shape of everything else. I had been filing internal capital requests for every item Emrys wrote up. PSV testing interval protocol, submitted within 3 weeks of the first write-up. Secondary containment inspection, submitted 2 weeks after the second visit. ESD calibration, submitted the same week as the third. I had escalated the PSV request twice when procurement stalled it. I had sent the escalation directly to the VP of operations with language I would describe as strongly worded, which is not something I normally do, and which had not yet moved the needle, but which was documented. Emrys did not know this. He knew what the company had done, which was approve the maintenance schedule item and stall the other two. And from his position, I was the face of the company that was stalling. That is a reasonable interpretation of the visible facts. It was not the accurate one. I couldn't tell him the accurate one. Not because I was protecting the company. I am not someone who protects organizations over people, but because there is a specific kind of internal advocacy that stops working the moment it becomes external. If the inspector knows you're fighting your own company, the company stops letting you fight. And I had been in a position to actually move things. Slowly. Insufficiently, but moving. This is the architecture I had been maintaining. And Emrys had been standing on the other side of it for 6 months, writing up a platform I was also trying to fix. And neither of us could say anything about it. The pressure oscillation on train 3 escalated at 16:30. The PSV on a compression train opens at a set pressure limit to release excess gas if the system runs abnormal. The problem Emrys had been flagging was that Train 3's PSV hadn't been tested in 9 months, meaning nobody knew with certainty whether it would open at the right pressure or at all. What we were seeing was system pressure climbing in irregular surges, not a runaway yet, but the pattern that precedes one if you don't intervene. The correct response was to reduce the compression rate manually and monitor until the oscillation stabilized or escalated to the point requiring emergency shutdown. I started the reduction sequence from the control room. Emrys stood at my shoulder and watched the gauges. You know this sequence, he said. I've been on this platform 11 times. Most ERCs run these calls from shore. Most ERCs don't receive their write-ups personally. There was a pause. The storm was making its presence known. The platform moved in ways that were within tolerance, but reminded you what you were standing on. Why did you? He said. I kept my eyes on the pressure display, because it seemed like the right thing to do for the company. No, I said. And then I stopped, because I had reached the edge of what I could say while the architecture was still intact. He didn't push it. He watched the gauges. At 17:45, the oscillation stabilized, not resolved. The PSV issue was still there, would need to be addressed properly, would be in Emrys's write-up, would be in my capital request by Monday morning, but manageable through the night. I logged the sequence. Emrys made notes in his inspection record. We were both doing our jobs in the way two people do their jobs when they've just been through something together and are still deciding what it meant. The control room on the Stellan 7 is 20 feet by 12. 2 operator consoles, a communication station, a small shift handoff table, and a window facing the separator deck and the Gulf beyond. At night in a hurricane, that window is mostly sound, the specific sound of wind and water that you learn to distinguish from structural distress after enough years offshore. I found coffee in the crew mess. I found 2 mugs. I brought them back. Emrys was at the table with his inspection binder. He looked up when I set a mug in front of him with the expression of someone who hadn't expected this. Black, I said. I don't know how you take it. Black is fine. He wrapped both hands around it. Thank you. We sat across from each other. The storm worked outside. The gauges held. The transfer request, he said eventually. I looked up. I submitted for MSD Pacific Northwest, Seattle. He looked at his coffee. It was approved last week. This is my last inspection on the Stellan 7 regardless of tonight. Something dropped in the floor of my chest. I kept my expression calibrated, which is something I'm good at, and which was, in that moment, the wrong instinct. When do you go? 3 weeks. The platform moved. I identified the motion as within tolerances and let it go. Why Pacific Northwest? I asked. He looked at me. That look, the one I'd been cataloging without admitting it across 4 desk interactions, and which I was now receiving at close range in a control room during a Category 2 hurricane. Change of scenery, he said. From the Gulf. From a specific aspect of the Gulf. I sat with that. You put in the request 4 months ago, I said, before the last 2 write-ups? Yes. So it wasn't about the inspection findings escalating. He was quiet for a moment. Calix, he said. The first time he'd used my first name in 6 months. I should stop here and be precise about something, because this is the part that requires precision. There is a specific architecture to a professional relationship that is also something else. The something else is always present. It's in the room when you're in the room together. It's in the documents you hand across a desk. It's in the fact that you drive 45 minutes to Galveston to receive a write-up when you could send anyone else. The architecture contains it, keeps it from requiring acknowledgement. This is functional. This is how work gets done. The architecture holds until it doesn't. And it doesn't hold in a hurricane with nowhere left to be. Why did you drive to the office yourself, he said, every time. I told you, because it seemed like, I know what you told me. He set down his mug. I'm asking what you didn't. I looked at the pressure gauges. They were steady. I had no reason to keep looking at them. I was trying to fix it, I said. Every item you cited. I want you to know that before anything else. I know. I stared at him. You couldn't have. I read internal procurement documentation as part of my inspection scope, he said. Requisition filings, maintenance schedules, capital request approvals. I've been reading your name on those filings for 4 months. He held my gaze. You submitted capital requests for all 3 cited items, in sequence, within 3 weeks of each of my write-ups. You filed 2 escalations on the P item. I have the requisition numbers. The storm did something loud against the west panels. I waited for it to pass. You knew, I said. I confirmed it 4 months ago. And then you requested the transfer. Yes. The Gulf was still working outside. The platform held. Emrys, I said. That is a very strange response to finding out I was on your side. He looked at his hands on the coffee mug for a long moment. When he looked up, there was something in his face that the architecture had been preventing, and that the architecture could no longer prevent. Yes, he said. It was. Here is what I have to tell you about the next few minutes. I had spent 6 months being professional at a person I had no professional reason to drive 45 minutes to see. I had signed write-ups I completely agreed with and said we're working on it, when what I meant was, I know, I'm trying. I can't say that to you. I had maintained an architecture of appropriate distance across 4 desk interactions and 1 very loud storm. And I had done it because it was necessary, and because I was not willing to risk the internal leverage I had. The small, slow-moving leverage I had built over 8 months of pushing against procurement and operations and a VP who did not want to spend the capital. And then Emrys Hale had found out I was trying and had requested a transfer to Seattle. Why Seattle? I said again. He was quiet for a long time. Because you were the one thing about this posting I couldn't assess properly, he said. And I don't work well when I can't assess properly. You were avoiding incomplete data. I was avoiding, he stopped, started again. I was avoiding what happens when the data comes in and the assessment changes and you're standing in a professional context that has no room for what the assessment now says. The pressure gauges were steady. Outside, the storm was past its worst. I could tell by the change in the platform's motion, settling from its maximum into something still significant, but no longer escalating. Weather moves in rhythms when you know how to read them. Show me your phone, he said. I looked at him. Your internal emails, the escalation filings, if they're there. I unlocked my phone. I opened the email chain. I slid it across the table. He read. He didn't take long. He's a fast reader, which I had observed across 4 desk interactions, and which I noted now because apparently I am incapable of not noting things about him. He read the chain from the first capital request to the most recent escalation to the VP, which had been sent 11 days ago, and which had the subject line, PSVTEST interval, HIRD escalation. Please advise ONHOLD in a tone that was, for my industry and my role, genuinely unusual. He looked up. 3rd escalation, he said. Yes, you've been doing this for 8 months. The first request predates your first write-up by 2 months. I had flagged the PSV interval myself. Your write-up confirmed my assessment. I looked at him. I agreed with every item you cited. I agreed before you cited them. Something moved across his face, the specific expression of a structural assessment that has just had its load calculation confirmed. You couldn't tell me, he said. If I tell the inspector I'm internally fighting the same fight, the company stops letting me fight. I become a liability instead of an advocate. I paused. I was in a position to actually move things, slowly, but moving. And now, Train 3's PSV is still untested. The ESD calibration is approved but not scheduled. The containment inspection is in procurement review. I held his gaze. The write-ups still stand. I'm still going to file the capital requests. Nothing about the situation changes. Nothing about the professional situation, he said. No, everything else might. Yes, I said. Everything else might. The storm eased at 0115. I know the exact time because I logged it in the operational record, which is the kind of thing I do, and which Emrys had made a small sound about that I was choosing to interpret as affectionate. We had talked for most of those hours. Not about the platform, we'd covered the platform, but about the things that don't come up across a desk in a MSD office. He had grown up in Cardiff, Wales, moved to the US for college, stayed because the Coast Guard felt like the right institution for someone who wanted to make safety mean something. He had a way of saying, make safety mean something that didn't sound like a slogan, which it can, and which in his mouth it didn't. I had grown up in Beaumont, Texas, 45 minutes from this coast, which he found interesting in a way he didn't elaborate on. I had gone into offshore emergency management because I had watched the Deepwater Horizon coverage when I was 18 and had needed to do something with the feeling it left me with. He had understood that without explanation. The transfer requisition form, he said, around 0200. I looked up from the pressure display. Takes 3 business days to process, he said. If I file it Monday. I looked at him. I would need a reason. There are approved categories. He paused. Personal circumstances is one of them. Is that specific enough? For the form? Yes. He held my gaze. For me to file it, I need to know if the circumstances are actually personal, or if this is, he gestured at the control room, the storm, the platform, all of it, circumstantial. I stood up from the console. I crossed the 12 feet of control room. I sat down in the chair across from him at the shift handoff table, which put approximately 2 feet of table between us rather than the 6 feet of console distance we'd been maintaining. I said, I have driven 45 minutes to Galveston 4 times in 6 months to receive write-ups for a platform I had independently flagged the same issues on, when I could have sent my assistant, when I could have received them by email, when there was no operational reason for the ERC to be present at write-up delivery. I looked at him. What does that tell you about the circumstances? He looked at me for a long, specific moment. That they're personal? He said, yes. And you want me to file the rescission. I want you to make that decision for yourself, I said. But I want you to make it with accurate information, which is, I paused. Stay. That's the accurate information. I want you to stay. The storm had mostly passed. The Gulf outside was running heavy still, the aftermath, the cleanup. But the worst of it was north of us, moving toward the Louisiana coast, leaving behind the particular exhausted quality of air that has been through something significant. He reached across the table, his hand, palm up, in the space between the 2 coffee mugs. I looked at it. I looked at him, at this precise, quiet, accurate man who had been right about everything for 6 months and who had driven 45 minutes to Galveston 4 times for the same reason I had, and I put my hand in his. I'm still writing up the PSV, he said. Write it up. And the ESD calibration. I'll file the capital request the same day you submit it. The corner of his mouth did something. That's an efficient system. I work in safety management, I said. I optimize for throughput. He pressed his lips together against something that was almost a laugh. His fingers closed around mine, careful and certain, the grip of a man who has assessed the situation and made his decision and is not going to revisit it. Monday, he said. Monday. The helicopter came at 0531. The Gulf in the hour before dawn after a hurricane has a specific quality of light, gray and honest and raw, the color of something that has been through something and is still here. I stood on the helipad and watched it come in from the northwest, and Emrys stood beside me with his inspection bag and his Coast Guard hard hat, and the particular quality of stillness that I realized, going to be spending a considerable amount of time learning the precise vocabulary of. We didn't speak while we waited. We didn't need to. There's a security camera on corridor D, deck 3, aiming to the walkway from the control room to the helipad. It loops footage every 72 hours, and nobody watches it unless there's an incident report. If you had pulled the 0528 recording from that camera, you would have seen 2 men in orange offshore coveralls walking side by side toward the helipad in the pre-dawn gray. One carrying a company emergency kit, one with a Coast Guard inspection bag, the Gulf still running heavy behind them. 8-foot swells, the aftermath. The platform moving in the constant way platforms move after a storm. At a certain point, the walkway narrows, and the man on the left shifted slightly, and the man on the right shifted slightly, and for the remaining 40 feet to the helipad, they were walking close enough that their sleeves were touching. Neither of them moved to create more space. The helicopter lifted. The Gulf fell away beneath them, enormous and green and completely itself. Somewhere below, the Stellan 7 sat in the morning light, with its pressure system stable and its muster station empty, and one more write-up waiting to be filed, and one capital request that would be submitted the same day. On a Monday, 3 business days later, a transfer requisition form was processed by the USCG MSD Administrative Office in Galveston. The stated reason was personal circumstances. It was the accurate thing to say.